The subject of consciousness has been an area in the field of philosophy that has vexed philosophers for millennia. Philosophers from Plato to Descartes to Leibniz to Hume and even to John Stuart Mill have spent time developing theories on the nature of consciousness. However, the advancements made from the birth of psychology with Wilhelm Wundt to our knowledge of neuroscience today make the study of consciousness and discussions on them much more profound than they ever were. Consciousness is one of those words that have a lot of meanings, and there is no universally accepted definition in the field of philosophy, but I will be using the term, as most philosophers do, to mean subjective experience. This definition stems from Thomas Nagel's famous essay, What is it like to be a bat? Essentially, the thesis of this essay is, if there is something that it is like to be a bat, then the bat is conscious. If the atoms that make me were rearranged into a table, then presumably there would be no experience nor anything that it would be like to be that table. Therefore, the table would not be conscious. However, if the atoms that make me were rearranged into a living bat, then presumably there would be some experience, and so it would be something that it would be like to be that bat, and therefore I, as a bat, would be conscious. I will be using consciousness, soul, and mind interchangeably to all mean the same thing here: subjective experience. I'm doing this for three reasons. The first is to use the same words used by philosophers such as Descartes. Descartes never actually used the term consciousness, but he used the term soul in place of it. Of course, the soul isn't exactly the same thing as consciousness, but conscious experience is a large part of what the soul is, at least in the way that Descartes wrote about it. The second reason is to stress the word mind in philosophy means consciousness, and it is not the same thing as a brain. The brain in philosophy only refers to the physical organ in our heads. And the third reason is not to repeat the word consciousness 100 times. And also, the word mental and the word physical will also be used interchangeably with mind and matter, respectively. There are two main categories that encompass most of the positions and views on the nature of consciousness: substance dualism and substance monism. René Descartes is considered the father of substance dualism. This is the position that holds the mental and physical are different substances, or two fundamental but entirely independent entities of reality that are the constituents of everything within it. The mental substance being non-physical, and the physical substance, being physical. Substance dualists, like Descartes, but not all dualists, believe that the mind can exist without the body, and the body can exist without the mind. Descartes believed that humans were the only organisms with a soul, and so when our physical bodies die, our soul lives on without our bodies. Non-human animals, however, had no souls and were considered by Descartes to be mechanisms or automatons who lived and operated without consciousness. Animals are therefore bodies living without minds. Descartes also believed that, although the two were distinct substances, the mind could still control the body. One of the main arguments against substance dualism is the interaction problem. How could it be that the mind, something non-physical, could control the body, which is something physical? I don't know of a way that it could do so without violating the laws of physics. Here is TMM.
A classic objection to dualism is that in order for something non-physical to interact with a physical system, it would have to either inject new energy into the system, violating the law of conservation of energy, or it would have to rearrange the energy already in the system, violating the law of conservation of momentum. Another problem is that all known interactions can be described as being comprised of one or more of four fundamental kinds of interaction. There's interaction via the exertion of the weak nuclear force, the exertion of the strong nuclear force, the exertion of the electromagnetic force, and the exertion of the force of gravity. To say that something non-physical interacts with the physical is to say either that there is some additional and so far undetected kind of interaction, which is unsubstantiated, or it is to say that this non-physical thing exerts one of the four fundamental forces. Non-physical things don't have mass, therefore they can't exert the force of gravity. They don't emit electromagnetic fields, so they don't exert the electromagnetic force. They don't emit or absorb bosons, which is the nature of the weak nuclear force, and they don't emit a strong force field, so they don't exert the strong nuclear force either.
Another argument that makes substance dualism untenable is that we have empirical evidence that goes against it. Under dualism, one would expect that consciousness, something non-physical, would not be affected by anything physical. But this is simply not the case. Psychologists and neuroscientists have been able to associate and pinpoint the kinds of neurotransmitters that are responsible for certain states of consciousness, such as lust, love, happiness, grief, sadness, depression, and even conscious awareness itself. We know that the conscious state of depression is heavily associated with low levels of serotonin. So how do we go about treating it? Psychiatrists administer patients with these types of psychopathologies medications, such as Prozac, that boost their levels of serotonin. Surely enough, the patient will later report that their depression, a state of their consciousness, has improved for the time being. Under substance dualism, we would not expect to see that damage to something physical, such as the brain, would affect something non-physical, like consciousness. Phineas Gage, a 19th century railroad construction foreman, survived a gruesome accident in which an explosive caused a 3.5-foot long and 1-inch wide iron rod to get shot right through his head, destroying most of his frontal cortex. Phineas Gage, who was a jovial and hard-working individual prior to the accident, suffered a dramatic personality change in which he became disrespectful, irritable, and less skilled and hardworking at his craft. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain mostly responsible for decision-making and emotional processing. Substance dualism cannot account for this. I have also linked a video in the description analyzing split-brain patients and their conscious awareness. These are patients whose corpus callosum, the part of the brain that allows for information to be shared between the left and right hemispheres of the brain, has been surgically removed in order to reduce epileptic seizure. Substance monism is the position that holds that there's only one substance that is the constituent of reality. This raises the question, well, which substance is it, mind or matter? This is where we create two subcategories within the metacategory of substance monism, which is idealism and physicalism. Idealism, put forward by the philosopher George Berkeley, is the position within substance monism that holds that reality is fundamentally only mind. There is no matter, and therefore there is no external world. In other words, nothing actually exists unless there is a mind there to construct it. One of the best arguments against idealism is known as the problem of continuity. If there is no external world, then why is it that what we perceive is always so uniform? Whenever I wake up, my room looks exactly the same. When I go to work, I always see the same people. And when I open the fridge for the 5th time to look for food, there still isn't anything I want to eat in there. How can we use science to develop laws of nature that never seem to break? How can idealism account for the precise changing of things during gaps in our experience of them? If I light a candle, leave it, and then come back to it an hour later, I will notice a particular amount of the candle wax to have melted. If I light the same kind of candle again, but this time I choose to watch it for an hour, I will notice that, more or less, the same amount of candle wax to have melted when the hour is up. Even things that I am not there to observe seem to be following the exact same processes as those same things that I am there to observe. There are rarely, if any anomalies. Surely, if the external world did not exist and reality was only a construction of our own mind, then this natural uniformity, which seems not to be contingent on our own perception of, thoughts on, or awareness of, need not be the case. Physicalism, a term coined by the philosopher Otto Neurath, is the position within substance monism that holds that reality is fundamentally only matter. Therefore, there is no substance of mind. This raises the question, so if idealism denies the existence of the external world, does physicalism deny the existence of the internal world? Well, no, it makes no sense to deny our own consciousness. As I said earlier, idealists deny the existence of everything except for one thing, and they don't doubt it, not for any special pleading purposes, but because it is actually the one thing they are unable to doubt. That one thing is their own conscious experience. But why? What makes them unable to deny the existence of their own conscious experience? René Descartes, in his seminal work, Meditations on First Philosophy, explains this in the first meditation, concerning those things that can be called into doubt, and in the second meditation, of the nature of the mind and that it is more easily known than the body. Descartes understood that acquiring knowledge from erroneous prior beliefs would not be conducive in trying to arrive at true knowledge. Building upon falsehood results in more falsehood. So Descartes decided that he must differentiate his true beliefs from his false ones. He decided to start from the bottom and work his way up, labeling all his beliefs as false, and then from there, through reason, he would decide what he could know for certain to be true. First, Descartes started with empirical knowledge, or knowledge derived through the senses. Descartes believed that this could be called into doubt because of the existence of things like illusions and dreams. Descartes believed that it was possible that his whole reality could just be one big dream, or just one big illusion that he was experiencing. There was no way for him to know for certain, so Descartes left empirical knowledge being potentially false. Descartes then went on to deductive forms of knowledge, such as math and logic. Descartes considered that even if his senses deceive him, and what he was experiencing was an illusion, it's still true that 2 plus 3 equals 5, and a square will always have 4 sides. Then, however, Descartes considered that there could be a monotheistic god, or an evil demon, that, using its powers, was deceiving Descartes into believing in the soundness of his mathematical equations and his logical syllogisms. Descartes left deductive forms of knowledge as being potentially false. Now, Descartes moved on to his own existence. Was it possible that his own existence was an illusion? Could the evil demon be deceiving Descartes into believing in Descartes' own existence? Descartes realized that he must exist by virtue of the fact that he is thinking at all. From here came the famous line, cogito ergo sum, or, I think therefore I am. But hasn't Descartes just used logic to prove his own existence? That sentence is in the form of an argument, isn't it? After all, he used the word therefore in it. Well, although Descartes did write it in the form of an argument, it could be better put as, I am experiencing. And this is true by virtue of the fact that he is literally experiencing at that very moment. His physical body could have been an illusion, as, after all, he can only perceive his body through his own senses, but not his own consciousness. Thus, Descartes demonstrated that the existence of his own existence, or the existence of his own conscious experience, was the only thing that could not and cannot be brought into doubt. Okay, so now that we know that our own consciousness is the one thing that cannot be doubted, where do we go from here? How does physicalism account for the existence of consciousness if the only thing that exists fundamentally is matter? This is what philosopher David Chalmers has dubbed the hard problem of consciousness.
The hard problem of consciousness is the problem of how physical processes in the brain give rise to the subjective experience of the mind and of the world. If you look at the brain from the outside, you see this extraordinary machine, an organ consisting of 84 billion neurons that fire in synchrony with each other. When I see, visual inputs come to my eyes, photons hit my eyes, they send a signal that goes up the optic nerve to the back of my brain. It sends neural firings propagating throughout my brain, and eventually I might produce an action. From the outside, though, I look like a complicated mechanism, a robot. This is how science might describe me from the objective point of view. But there's also a subjective point of view. There's what it feels like for the agent who is seeing the scene. When I see you, I see colors, I see shapes, I have an experience from a first-person point of view. There's something it's like to be me.
How does non-conscious objective matter bring about conscious subjective experience? Here's where physicalism breaks into a few other categories. Emergentism is the position that holds that consciousness is nothing more than an emergent property of the matter in the brain. An emergent property can be seen when a system gains a property that each of its constituent parts did not have. The system gains that property as a result of these constituent parts working together and being organized in a certain way. Atoms are non-conscious, but when arranged in the way that they are in the brain, produce consciousness. Each individual atom in a self-replicating molecule, such as RNA or DNA, does not have the property of self-replication. But when these atoms are arranged into the molecular formula of RNA or DNA, the RNA or DNA system gains the property of self-replication. Self-replication is an emergent property of the matter in DNA or RNA. So consciousness, analogously, is an emergent property of the matter in the brain. One of the main criticisms of emergentism is that all the emergent properties we have seen still lie in the same category as its constituent parts do. Although self-replicating molecules arise from atoms without the ability to individually self-replicate, the two are still in the same category of objective and externally observable things. Non-conscious material atoms give rise to non-conscious material self-replication. However, neurons in the brain and consciousness are two entirely separate categories, the neurons being objective and externally observable, and consciousness being subjective, and as such it is only subject to the individual experiencing it, indetectable completely to the outside world. Another position within physicalism is property dualism. This is the position that holds that there is only the physical substance, but physical substances both have physical properties and mental properties. Panpsychism, a position within property dualism, holds that consciousness is fundamentally imbued with matter. In other words, consciousness is a property of matter itself. This position, although a popular one in the past, was treated as farcical in the 20th century, and its respectability as a position was stripped from it by the logical positivist philosophy. However, it has been gaining popularity in recent years. To say that consciousness is imbued with matter is not to say that atoms have the same kind of complex consciousness that humans do, but there is some extremely rudimentary form of consciousness found in atoms.
That view is caricatured as like, oh, so rocks are thinking?
Right.
It's like, well, no.
Right.
We conflate thinking with consciousness, which is a point that you make in the book and that many people, I think, don't totally understand.
Yeah.
Partly because it just so happens that humans think constantly.
Right.
So
that's in our consciousness.
Right.
Yeah.
So we assume that thinking is intrinsic to consciousness.
Yes.
But consciousness is a completely different thing from thinking, certainly than linguistic thought.
Yes, absolutely.
So you could imagine a sort of pure stream of consciousness, just experience almost like just a white light with no other sensory dimension, just sight, for example.
Yeah.
Something very rudimentary.
Yeah.
You can imagine that pervading the universe or that being what it's like to be an atom.
Part of matter.
Say.
Yeah.
One argument against panpsychism is known as the combination problem. How do billions of atoms with rudimentary forms of consciousness combine to form our own complex consciousness? And are the atoms that make up our own consciousness still conscious? However, I don't think that this is a big problem for panpsychism. Just as the combination of physical atomic matter can produce more complex matter, conscious atoms can produce more complex forms of consciousness. Another argument against panpsychism is the fact that it isn't testable scientifically. We can't test whether things without brains are conscious, and to a degree, we can't even test that non-human animals are conscious, as consciousness is only accessible to the subject experiencing it. The reason that we can know that other humans are conscious is that other humans can reflect on the nature of their own consciousness, and if they can do that, they must be conscious. Non-human animals are not able to reflect on the nature of their own consciousness, and even if the more intelligent ones like dolphins and chimpanzees are able to do so to some extent, we certainly can't tell that they do. We just infer that non-human animals are conscious because they, like us, are biological organisms and have much of the same brain structures and neurons that are associated with consciousness in humans. The only kind of consciousness that we are aware of is the one that, through scientific experimentation, we have learned is likely a product of our brains. Things that can't demonstrate that they can reflect on their own consciousness, and things that do not have brains at all, their consciousness, if there is consciousness at all, is a non-starter for the scientific method. From atoms to rocks, all the way to plants, there is no way to test whether they are conscious or not. This is why panpsychism is untestable. What our findings in psychology and neuroscience seem to suggest is that consciousness is purely physical. As stated earlier, when scientists learn what a certain neurotransmitter is responsible for, they can predict that manipulating it can affect a person's consciousness in a certain analogous way, and every time, that prediction checks out. Scientists learn that low levels of serotonin in the brain are responsible for depression. They bump up the serotonin levels in the brain, and then they see an improvement in the patient's depression. All the evidence in psychology and neuroscience seem to point to a physical consciousness. Philosophical arguments can have their merit, but when it comes to making empirical claims about the world, we need to go with the empirical, scientific evidence. There are several other positions and views in the philosophy of mind, but this video is only to serve as an introductory video, taking the viewer through the main positions and ideas. And so, if you'd like to see more videos on consciousness, please let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and subscribe for more content. Thanks.